Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our event today. What's the oil rush in Somalia? My name is Jess Watkins, and I work for the Middle East Centre and the Conflict Research Programme at the LSE, and I'll be chairing the event today. The Conflict Research Programme is a 3-year programme funded by FCDO, formerly DFID. It works across Iraq, Syria, DRC, South Sudan, and Somalia, and it's now in its final year. Our topic today concerns the political dynamics surrounding oil and gas prospects in Somalia. And in fact, our presenter, Joachim Gundel, wrote a blog on this subject a few months ago, which has the highest readership of all our blogs produced by the CRP over the last 3 years. So before we start, I'd like to mention that the CRP Somalia programme will also be hosting another event online next month on the 10th of October on the Galkayo Peace Agreement, and of course you're welcome to attend that. As for the format for today's event, the main presentation will be by Joachim and will last between 15 and 20 minutes, followed by some short responses by our 3 panelists. And we'll turn to Q&A after that, where you, the audience, can pose questions for the Q&A. And feel free to start posting your questions during the presentations. The event is being recorded today. So just to introduce our panelists, Joachim Gundel is the recipient of a small grant from the Conflict Research Programme and a well-known voice on Somali issues. He's worked in and on Somalia for over 20 years in different capacities, including as a member of the UN panel of experts on Somalia and Eritrea. Very welcome today, Joachim. We're also joined by Dr. Mohammed Gas. Mohammed has a PhD in development studies from Norwegian University of Life Sciences, and he's worked in various research capacities on the Horn of Africa and Somalia, and has published on a number of themes, including in areas of peace building and piracy. Welcome also to Abdulsalam Mohammed, who is an economist and a PhD candidate at the Adam Smith Institute, University of Glasgow. He's worked in Somalia for the United Nations Development Programme as a consultant. Finally, a warm welcome to Dr. Claire Elder, who actually isn't here yet, but she'll be joining us shortly. She's a fellow at the LSE at the Centre for Public Authority and International Development. Claire completed her PhD at the University of Oxford in 2019, and before that she worked for the International Crisis Group in Nairobi. Her research is on diaspora politics, transnational governance, and business-state relations in Somalia. So welcome to all of our panelists and also to you, the audience. And I'm just going to pass it over to Joachim.
Thank you very much, Jessica, for the good introduction and the presentation. So I will skip that part on my own part. So I had the opportunity given by the Conflict Research Programme to dive a little bit into what's actually going on with the oil sector and the prospects for oil in Somalia and debt relief in regards to the research theme in the program, which is about the political marketplace. So basically, we've been trying to look at what are the implications of the future prospects of oil in Somalia on the political marketplace. That takes us through a lot of issues. Now, many might want to know whether there actually is petroleum in Somalia, to what extent it's true or not, etc. I'm not really going to dive so much into that aspect, other than stating that, well, I mean, a lot of efforts has been made, and different parties are trying to get into the picture, which basically is evidence enough for the notion that there is petroleum, right? So I'm just trying to get this one up on top of the screen. I hope everyone can see the map. So basically, this is kind of a generic map based on all the findings that are there, which basically shows that there is offshore potentials and there is onshore potentials, and most of the onshore were investigated in the 70s and the 80s. and the offshore was investigated first by the Summer Oil arrangement, and then by the Spectrum, which is also a Norwegian survey company, in 2014 and 2015 respectively. And this led to conclusions that the prospects were sufficiently promising for actually starting to organize the oil sector more operationally. So, nevertheless, there has not been any really big oil strikes yet. So, in terms of whether it actually is going to take off and how costly it's going to be to explore for the petroleum and gas that might be, is still something that is to be seen. Nevertheless, the belief is strong enough for both various Somali and external actors to pursue oil exploration. In the past, we would have seen a number of oil concessions that was given before the Civil War, and this map shows approximate locations of these old areas. So this is one of the components that had to be clarified, because when the state collapsed, then all of these concessions by the oil majors basically went into force majeure, which means that they, once the Somalia state came back together, then they would claim the rights to continue the exploration in these areas. So this is one of the issues that has been outstanding. In the meantime, there has been a long period of stalemate, so to speak, where it has come down to the different various regional administrations, Puntland, Somaliland, the Galmudug area, etc., who have tried to engage various oil companies in their prospects of trying to exploit the natural resources. But that comes to a change in 2012, and I will get a little bit further back to that later. In 2020 February, Somalia finally saw a new thorough petroleum law being passed in the government. It was passed through the two legislative chambers and ratified by the president. Still, and this is one of the elements of the analysis, it turns out that the legislative framework for licensing and management, etc., is still not complete, it's still not ready. There's, for instance, an entity which is sponsored by the World Bank and the IMF and the donors, which is called the Financial Governance Committee. And the Financial Governance Committee, in its most recent report that was issued in June, actually points out some of the missing elements. And I will come back to some of that later in the presentation. Oil also became part and parcel of the process of the debt relief process, because the gas futures and the oil futures are visioned to be key for Somalia's future ability to pay back on future loans that will be opened up once the debt relief completion point has been passed in a couple of years. Although direct benefits and flows from the oil sector so far has been very little, because there's no real production being taking place, the prospects nevertheless still play an important role in the political marketplace for various reasons. The sector has been driven forward by a combination of external forces, interests from various different types of oil companies, but also from major states who have not been going about it in a direct manner, but they have kind of have their indirect interests in which are motivating a lot of their interventions in Somalia. There's also a lot of work, and I mentioned that, to be done in regards to finishing the regulative and legislative framework. For instance, the resource sharing agreement, even though it was agreed on in 2018 in Baidoa, which is the resource sharing agreement, is a basic agreement which the leaders of the different federal member states and the federal governors of Somalia came together and agreed on how the basic natural resources should be shared in Somalia. That has in principle been written into the petroleum law, but the resource sharing agreement, however, has some outstanding issues and kind of some inbuilt elements, which means that it's most likely going to come under pressure again, and it's most likely going to be needed to be renegotiated. Furthermore, in the agreement, it was also agreed that there has to be established a natural resource commission, which has not been done yet, which is to settle resource sharing issues as they go along. And if that is going to be set up, most likely the Baidoa agreement needs to be renegotiated as well. So it can't be a fixed agreement. The production sharing agreements. The production sharing agreements are vital for the point of entering into contracts with the oil companies that are interested in exploring for oil. Now, the production sharing agreements are still outstanding, although the petroleum law was ended, although the government, the Ministry of Petroleum, already have launched the oil licensing round, which happened in August. The actual model production sharing agreement has not really been passed. It hasn't really been finalized, which means that's one of the major important instruments that is not ready and in place yet. And as the Financial Governance Committee points out, it needs to be aligned with the procurement law, because the procurement law clearly states that concessions in natural resources, and in the oil sector in particular, has to be following the principles of the procurement law as well. So that can't be left to the Ministry of Petroleum. It can't be left to the newly established Somalia Petroleum Authority. Mentioning the Somalia Petroleum Authority is a controversial element due to the way that it was appointed right after the dismissal of the former Prime Minister, Hassan Kaira, because according to the Constitution, paragraph Article 97(4), once a Prime Minister has been dismissed in the way that the Prime Minister was dismissed, basically the cabinet is dissolved automatically, which means that until a new Prime Minister has been appointed, the government cannot appoint any new commissions. And it was not only the Somalia Petroleum Authority this happened to, it happened to the Justice Service Commission, it happened to the Anti-Corruption Commission that was being set up. So all of these are considered controversial and can be elements of dispute amongst the Somalis, not at least in the coming time. So all of that is part of the legal side that questions how wise it is to pursue the oil licensing round when there are so many uncertainties out there. The study itself shows that the potential of flow of future oil resources is come to a point where it has already, even before profit has actually been able to come out of it, it has already become a major token of transaction in buying loyalty, in compliance, in the games that are taking on in the political marketplace. And this is partly because gaining control over the future resources is important to the actors. So they're actually thinking ahead in the sense that we need to be the ones, we need to have our people in the system that is coming up. The institutions that's going to be established, we need our people to be in them. This opens the actors potential access to informal flows and resources from foreign actors who wants to access the oil deposits. Secondly, a lot of the debt relief efforts has been concentrating on one of the key benchmarks that was used was Somalia's ability and the increase of resources taxation and raising domestic revenue. However, the more that is going to be institutionalized and the more that is going to be progressed on in terms of good governance, more interest may grow in terms of accessing oil resources, because they might actually be easier to divert and siphon off from the formal flows than direct taxation is. Now, why is it important to say that? And that is because one of the key aspects of the political, I wouldn't say system, but the political dynamics, the political way the Somali politics works, is that it's entirely dependent on the flow of money and resources. And we're going to see that again for the third or fourth or fifth time in the upcoming elections. I wouldn't call them elections, I would call them selections, because it all comes down to a question of who selects the selectors. And this is, in this process, money plays a major role. Not only in terms of you have to pay in the new agreement that just came up, you have to pay $10,000 to be able to stand for the parliament, and 20,000 for the upper house. So the candidates, they need to get this money paid. They don't necessarily always have it. They will have sponsors that they will need to repay. Furthermore, to get your support, money flows. I mean, it's a public secret. And oil most likely is already playing a part of this game, and there's a hope that the oil licenses might play into to the hands who might control this in the political processes that are to come. Geostrategically, Somalia is returning more and more to the scene. For various reasons, partly because of the location of the entry into Aden and the access to the Suez Canal. The piracy issue showed the importance of that, but increasingly petroleum and gas can be a strategic resource to be in terms of, it's very important to gain control of, but even if you're not going to explore immediately, it can be a future reserve once other reserves starts falling out. And even though the world is changing towards sustainable types and other types of energies, it's most likely that there will still be a need of petroleum for a long period of time. And the other aspect is that as the American and the Chinese rivalries are increasing, and China having very limited direct oil resources, the Chinese interest is going to play an important role. And in that regard, the objective interest of the United States, for instance, would be, even though they would not necessarily go directly into investing in oil production right now, they might want to prevent the Chinese taking control of it. Other new actors in the game are the Gulf states, Qatar and United Arab Emirates, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and I will mention the United Kingdom in a little bit later. But these are some of the major interests. There has been a rivalry between Qatar and the Emirates in Somalia, in particular, in which they have been competing, supporting different sides in the political process, making major investments. The UAE has made major investments in the ports in Berbera, in Somaliland, in the port of Bostazo. The Turkish are promising a major investment in the Hobyo port. And all of these are strong elements in the issue of oil and politicking at the same time. So, apart from the security risks in Somalia's protracted armed conflict with Al-Shabaab, the political instability and the lack of functional political and administrative institutions that are risks that may hold investors back. And although oil and gas contracting still needs full compliance with Somalia's legal framework, and that Somalia is not quite ready for managing oil production and resources, Somalia has still been pushing ahead for various reasons. The Financial Governance Committee flagged oil licensing in its report in 2020 as a major procurement risk. So, the controversial appointment of the SPA board is another example of the political immaturity of the Somali institutional capacity, and pushing it ahead raises the suspicion that this is being done for political reasons, and for the reasons, as I mentioned, that the incumbents might be seeking early payoffs, and these payoffs. In terms of contracting, one of the immediate benefits that can come from licensing is what they call the signing bonuses. And a signing bonus can, for instance, be on the value of $2 million. And that in itself may not sound considerably much, but in terms of an election period, and the need to spin off promises and benefits in an election period, it can actually contribute substantially to changing quite a number of votes and winning seats in the coming parliament. Right. So we are talking about control over the future potential hydrocarbon resource extraction in the long run, and ensuring signing bonuses and fees and informal political funds in the short to immediate run. The paper issues a little bit more details on these issues. However, there's quite a number. We came across quite a number of issues that can be mentioned. There can be names that can be mentioned, and that's actually not the purpose of this research to point out who's been the wrongdoers. What is important here is that the process of that we have seen with establishing an oil regime in Somalia is that it's not clearly still opening up for the potential of building institutions rather than contributing further and to deepening the political type of marketplace. And the problem with the political type of marketplace is that it generates interest in the political sector, which is to maintain their power, which requires informal flows, rather than focusing on the institutions that can limit their control of those flows. And as long as there's not powerful enough forces to do that, then it's hard to see how Somalia will be progressing towards a path that will lead it out of this. Let's see. So the current logic in the political marketplace is that it is more important to have your people in control of the emerging institutions than establishing functional institutions that follow the principle of good governance. This is what happened with the Somalia Petroleum Authority. It was also an important part of the infights that were there that involved the former Prime Minister Hassan Kaira, who became known because he had a strong stake in the summer oil arrangement. And I need to mention the summer oil arrangement because it's actually an example of how things can go wrong when there's not a proper and strong legislative framework to follow, when there's not a strong enough control with the sector. And you know, when you enter into a agreement with an oil company, which is not even an oil company at the time, and it was probably pushed forward by most likely United Kingdom, and where parts of the arrangements, although some of the interviews that we made, you know, or some of the actors involved at the time, you know, justified it by the fact that we could not say no to the arrangement because we have so little resources in the field, and here comes this oil company that helps us with information and helps us to make a survey, and they want something in exchange. And one of the things they wanted in exchange was a number of oil blocks. And I'm just going to, before I end the presentation, I'm just going to share with you a map that shows the issue. Now I just need to find the sharing button on this one. Just bear with me one moment. Here we go. Yeah, so if everyone can see this map here. So this is a map which basically shows the blocks that are for sale on the oil in the new oil licensing round. That's the blocks that are numbered 152, 153, which are related to Galmudug, 164, 165, which is related to the state of Hirshabelle, 177, 178, which are related to the Southwest state, and 204, which is related to Jubaland. Now, what is interesting here in regards to the Somalia agreement, and Somalia is now called Coastal Exploration, is that after they did their surveys and part of the agreement, they wanted to have up to 12 blocks of their choice to choose to make production sharing agreements with. And this agreement was never really put forward in public. It was never really, there was no really any transparency around it. And it has basically cast a deep shadow over the Somalia oil sector. So one of the things that a future and a new government really need to do is to clarify this agreement. What is actually the status so the entire Somali public knows what is going on, because as long as that is not being done, the future oil sector is going to be covered in lack of transparency and perceptions, misperceptions, and it will remain in the sphere, in a very opaque sphere, basically. So yes, I think my time is about to be up, isn't it? So I'm going to leave it to the commentators, and just to say that I mean, there are more details to discuss, and yeah, I will be very happy to answer any questions that's going to come around during the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joachim. Okay, yeah, so we are going to turn it over to our discussants. So Mohammed is going to kick us off. I think the discussants will take around 5 minutes each. So if you'd like to take the stage, take the floor. Sorry, Mohammed, you're still on mute. Hang on. I think you might have to start again. Hang on.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, we can hear you now.
Hi, everybody. My friend Joachim has presented a quite interesting, aspect relating to Somalia's oil and gas exploration and production possibilities in the future. His presentation analyzed various challenges brought by the institutional weakness, regulatory issues, and politics that can generate challenges and risks involved in the undertaking of venturing and licensing and the production of Somali oil and gas. Then the question becomes: is Somalia ready for this? You know, is Somalia ready, or whether Somalia is ready for going ahead with oil and gas licensing and eventual production? Then this question is highly contested, and different experts advance different views that are largely pessimistic. However, I personally believe that Somalia is ready for the production of oil. And this is not because of, I mean that, because of I underestimate challenges involved in undertaking the task or this task of developing hydrocarbon resources of the country. That where the challenges include, you know, infrastructure, lack of infrastructure, political tensions, weakness of institutions, or potential corruption of political actors, and insecurity brought by Al-Shabaab. And it's often pointed that those challenges combined with the possible resource scarce effect, it can pose huge challenges for oil companies, but also for Somalia itself to struggle and may potentially put the country in a position of a renewed determinantal and perpetual conflict that can undermine the nascent state building and do away the gradual progress that has been made so far in reestablishing Somalia. The basis of my argument is that, number one, if you look where Somalia traveled, you know, and how Somalia traveled from the last 10 years in terms of institutional building, in terms of laying out regulatory frameworks, whether it is that relates to oil and gas or whether relates to other aspects, you know, you can see that there has been a tremendous progress. And also in terms of, there has been progress in terms of reforming the Somali National Army, in terms of establishing the institutions, basic institutions of state. I'm not saying they are perfect, there are many problems, but I like to stay on the optimistic side, on the positive side. The other reason why I think Somalia is ready is, you know, the issue of oil and oil exploration, as my friend Yakum mentioned, it has been there since 1970, has been on the table in Somalia. And now, this could be one of the issues or one major thing that fast tracks the stability, political stability, social development, and economic development of Somalia, but also on defeating Al-Shabaab. Because if you look, the major issue now in Somalia that relates to this is the fact that institutions are weak, and the fact is that there is a tensions and tendency towards manipulation of those weak institutions. Those are, to me, not unique to Somalia, actually. I understand they create a lot of problems, but also it's a reality that Somalia, time and again, has proven it can find a point where things settle down. If you look now, the last conflict on the election in Somalia, where the federal state wanted one man, one vote, and the regional states were saying, look, you know, the time is very short. It's impossible. We do not control parts of the country. There are no institutions that can deliver those. And this election thing should have been planned and prepared for the last 3 years. If you look how they have settled, I mean, the political leaders, by coming together, by discussing thoroughly, and by compromising, it indicates that there is some sort of growing maturity, whether the institutions or the political actors. And whatever crisis that is political or otherwise in Somalia have some limits or threshold that when it reaches there, it has to settle down. And you know, that's one thing. When it comes to the potential contributory factor that this could bring to Somalia is, as Yakum already has mentioned it, you know, it already drew attention to, you know, rebuilding the state and Somalia and generated interest from international actors and oil companies. And to me, that's very positive because of this could help, you know, stabilize the country, could help, you know, sort out security challenges, including Al-Shabaab, including building institutions, but also could help creating, you know, employment, which is the most important aspect that the security issue is connected to. Because of, as we know, Al-Shabaab mainly recruits youngsters that are unemployed. So to me, I think we can discuss about the detail, we can have a different views, but I realize there are a lot of challenges, including the infrastructure. But also, I think to just cut it short, that the time has come, you know, Somali oil and gas resource to be explored, whatever incomplete regulatory or frameworks could be sorted out and corrected. And I'm not supporting any corruption or whatever, you know, looting resource of Somali people, but I know somewhere at some point, you know, there has to be institutions of accountability. And those institutions are growing by the day. And given the social structure of Somali people, I don't think it's ultimately possible in Somalia that few individuals manipulate the entire destiny of Somalis. Because of that is how we are structured. And the Somali people are very egalitarian, meaning that you have a sense of solidarity, whether that's based on clan or whether that's a cross clan. And at some point, there has to be, you know, some common ground, regardless of the difference of actors and the different segments of the society. And all of those puts me in a very positive and optimistic position without closing my eyes to the many challenges that Somalia has, you know, especially with regard to producing or exploring oil and gas. I think I will finish with this. I look forward, you know, the questions to answer questions and to discuss.
Thanks so much, Mohammed. So we're already getting a few questions in. Thanks for your questions. Please keep them coming. But also just to note that we have questions also coming in on Facebook, so we might not get around to answering all of them. We'll see how we go for time. If you would mind stating your name and affiliation, and also if your question is directed to anyone in particular on the panel, that would be helpful. So I'm going to hand it over to Abdussalam, and I see that Claire has joined us, so she can follow on immediately afterwards, and then we'll give Joachim a chance to reply to the discussants if he would like to. So, Abdussalam.
Yes, thank you very much. First, Joachim, many thanks for your presentation. It is indeed an interesting analysis, and you mentioned significant issues regarding the political marketplace of oil and gas sector in Somalia. I agree with some points in your presentation, such as the potential corruption risks associated with awarding operational subcontractors to political elites, the current administration nominating key political positions in the pre-election period, and the fact that overall legal and regulatory framework in Somalia is weak. Furthermore, the security situation of the capital, as well as many parts of Somalia, is really yet fragile. I also understand that oil and gas exploration in Somalia can lead into conflicts and political instability, as mentioned in a UN report in 2014. However, the UN report further emphasized that Somalia can continue the oil exploration process only if the legislative and regulatory framework is, as well as stable institutions, are in place. Therefore, my viewpoint is that since all regulatory issues and legal legal and regulatory issues as well as the managing institutions are in place, then my viewpoint is that Somalia can continue its licensing process. And however, I would add few comments and suggestions on the core issues that Joachim discussed. I'm of the view that despite the challenges being mentioned and the fact that Somalia is still recovering from political crisis, many years of civil unrest, foreign intervention, extremism, I still believe that Somalia can continue its licensing process. One of the reasons that the current government is pushing toward this licensing oil sector is connected to several issues. First, on 5th June 2018, the federal government and the member states signed the Baydhabo Agreement that concerns sharing, ownership, and management of natural resources. The agreement was signed by the ex-prime minister and the presidents of the federal member states. This is a two-page document which is written in Somali language. It's really perceived as a preliminary reference for the national resource sharing in Somalia. This agreement also constitutes several important issues, including the key roles of Ministry of Petroleum and Mineral Resources, the Somali Petroleum Authority, the Somali National Oil Company, and also establishment of sovereign wealth fund. Second, the Somali Parliament, both the upper and lower house, passed a petroleum law, which was later ratified by the President of Somalia in February 2020. Third, the government believes is that the legislative and regulatory framework, as well as agencies responsible for the management, supervision, and oversight of the oil and gas sector in Somalia is in place. As the member states signed the federal, as the member states and the federal government of Somalia signed the Baydhabo Agreement, I believe that it is now, the agreement is now considered as part of the constitution, actually. This means that the legislative and legal regulatory framework that will regulate oil and gas sector in Somalia is in place. Therefore, my argument is for the support of the licensing process likely stems from several reasons. The first one is that Somalia is an independent country. It has its right to decide its future. Our economy is underdeveloped. Our gross domestic product is only $5 billion US. This is according to the latest statistics published by the Somali government. Almost 80% of GDP comes from the remittances and international development assistance. Nearly 7 of 10 Somalis live in poverty. The country has predominantly young population with over 80% estimated to be the under age of 35, and unemployment rate of Somalia is close to 70%. As such, in the long term, our country cannot be dependent on foreign aid and international community support. Therefore, Somalia needs to exploit its vast and enormous gas and oil reserves. And also, it is really, I would like also to mention that the present government, the issue of oil exploration has been central to its national development policy. The current administration believes that future oil and gas revenues will be invested in vital sectors such as healthcare, education, security, social services, environment, infrastructure, reconciliation, and many more. It should also be noted that the 7 blocks that are currently being auctioned is not in the disputed area, actually. Therefore, the issue of maritime dispute between Kenya and Somalia has nothing to do with the current licensing round. It's also worth mentioning that these 7 blocks are only portion of Somalia's offshore. Here, the logic is that why we Somalis cannot exploit our oil reserves and see how it will reshape our future. It's also important to know that the actual realization of the oil and gas may take several years, in fact. And the fact that oil and gas exploration has a long history dating back even from 1960s and early 1970s, the present government's efforts in realizing its oil and gas reserves and starting the process as early as possible is something commendable, actually. I must say we must be very thankful to them. And I still also agree with Joachim that corruption, particularly in the pre-election period, may be one of the factors that are pushing for the licensing process, and that some officials, some government politicians may want informal quick cash. However, I'm still optimistic about the federal government respecting the Baydhabo Agreement, which also clearly mentions how the government and the member states will share fees and rents. Future, I have also finally to conclude my some kind of recommendations, and that is the establishment of independent wealth fund, which may constitute all the member states and the federal government of Somalia will be responsible for receiving all revenues from oil and gas. This may offer solution as well as reduce corruption. The legislative and regulatory framework for managing the sector is at least prepared. Policymakers from across the country should abide and respect it already. They should abide and respect the already legislative and regulatory framework in place. The federal government and the member states should cooperate in implementing all the agreed regulations. Also, the international community, the international oil production companies must also strictly abide by Somali's national laws. They should not start the exploration process without an adequate regulatory framework in place. As they have ample experience in this sector, they should also help the Somali authority to reduce potential challenges that may arise. And my final comment is that to benefit from this sector requires the collaboration of all parties involved. We all know that in general, institutions are weak in Somalia, corruption is still prevalent, and short-term control of resources between political elites still exists. Therefore, the exploitation of Somali's hydrocarbons should not be one that adds fuel to the fire. Exploration should only proceed if opportunities of benefiting from it outweigh potential risks associated with it. So my final conclusion is that I am actually supporting the Somali government to start its licensing process. And the reason is I have already mentioned it, is that we Somalis cannot be dependent on foreign assistance. We cannot be dependent on foreign intervention. The country needs its institutions to rebuild. It needs a lot of revenues, and that we cannot be in the future dependent on oil, dependent on international community support. That's my inputs, and thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Abdul Salam. Claire, I'm going to hand over to you.
Yeah, did you want to go to some of the questions first and then have me chime in? Go ahead and.
No, I think if we could have your comments and then we'll come back to the Q&A.
So thank you, first and foremost, thank you, Joachim, for your research and all the discussants for their comments. Apologies for my own delay. I have a heavy teaching load today. So first and foremost, I wanted to thank Joachim, who's done a great job in highlighting the complexities of oil governance in Somalia. He outlines the challenges regarding how global standards and legislations are implemented and how various stakeholders, state, non-state, and international compete and speculate during a critical period of pre-oil production. We have a strong understanding in academia and a lot of the policy work of the natural resource curse, the greed and grievance paradigm, but we know less about the politics of pre-production, and as it may set the course of governance and discourse for the rest of the resource exploitation process. I want to highlight 3 issues that Joachim's research and findings draw attention to, and as they should inform thinking, analysis, and policy moving forward, and all the contemporary debates that are being brought up in the Q&A. First regards the issue of corruption, as Joachim has highlighted, and transparency in terms of implementation gaps, but also as it pertains to broader gaps within global good governance standards. As Joachim rightly argues, in addition to nation institutions and the ruling coalition's stronghold over them right now, is the issue of licensing, which lies at the core of transparency issues in Somalia at the moment. Licensing and the link between petroleum and procurement legislation is one of the lowest scoring subcomponents of the 2018 Resource Governance Index across Africa. So this is an issue, this is a perennial issue across the continent. And the focus on licensing exposes a number of important issues, including economic intersectionality and the range of economic activities around oil production, including infrastructure contracting and logistics, and poor global standards that govern the behavior and actions of multinational corporations around licensing as to when companies can and should intervene. The failure to comply with rules for contract disclosure, as well as delays and incompleteness, have been a perennial cause of national and regional disputes in Somalia and Somaliland since 2012, but also earlier, as we know. Soma Oil, DP World, the list is numerous, and they're all interconnected. And that is largely an issue of implementation, but also kind of a misunderstanding of how we understand transparency, and the role of parliament and public debate, civil society over these activities. Botswana and Zambia, in terms of Africa, are specific cases where licensing authorities have improved the transparency of allocation processes, publishing requirements, and the rules of disclosing contracts online. Yet, and this is what I want to draw attention to, such transparency institutions and measures around contracts and oversight are unequipped to deal with issues of illicit financial flows, transparency in networks, including beneficial ownership schemes, and the opacity of transnational capital. At the heart of Somalia's oil agony is certainly the political funding associated with signature bonuses and speculative futures, as it breeds political competition and corruption, but also is the nature of transnational elite networks, their perceived collusion with foreign and multinational corporations, Hassan Kaira and the Norwegians, and the autonomous agency of often smaller companies that glide under the radar, skirting around global governance standards, exploiting local institutions and populations. It's these loopholes in the transparency and good governance agenda more broadly that lead to political and national disputes. The second point regards the dubious record of oil resource sharing arrangements as the foundation for enduring political deals and political settlements in federal and non-federal structures. And a recent study of Uganda, which is very different than Somalia, for obvious reasons, but which is frequently lauded for its quality of oil governance, Sam Hickey outlines how its successes are due to the political support and autonomy offered to pockets of bureaucratic effectiveness within its oil assemblage. He indicates that this is sustained because power is concentrated and around ideas of resource and development nationalism. South Sudan is, of course, a harrowing example of how even the promises of access to oil revenues that perhaps incentivize the SPLA to agree to the comprehensive peace agreement, nonetheless failed to secure its maintenance. In late January 2012, the government of South Sudan made the unprecedented decision to shut down oil production as a result of impasse in political negotiations between Juba and Khartoum that deprived political elites within the South Sudan of resources, and ultimately leading to the violent fragmentation of the political marketplace and the eruption of civil war. The risk now in Somalia is that the preeminence of oil is becoming the primary binding and bargaining chip between federal member states and the federal government that leave federal arrangements open to shocks, especially amidst global recessions, low oil markets, and strategies for more sustainable energy. Other governance indicators are going to be overshadowed by the preeminence of oil. We have seen how oil and the attendant links to maritime capitalism and trading infrastructure have become central to federal politics. The authoritarian tendencies of Formage's administration to influence elections in Hirshabelle, Southwest State, and Galmudug, and their efforts in order to rush the new petroleum law and control the Somali Petroleum Agency are a case in point. As Joachim highlights, the Financial Governance Committee has raised concern not only about the nature of this relationship between the federal government and the federal member states, but also about significant disparities in the revenue shares between the federal member states, and therefore advised in June 2020 that the terms of the agreement be reviewed periodically. At the core of all federal constitutional arrangements across Africa and more broadly is the issue of resource sharing. And in Somalia, federal member states are fighting for the principles of federalism to supersede centralism. However, beyond existing institutional arrangements and the implementation gaps is a need to understand also the local discourse on transparency that operates in dialogue with, but also beyond existing reform agendas. And the role of the business community is critical here as well, in order to understand how they can be potential positive allies in mediating the political crisis, as well as potential activists in perpetuating poor governance. So those are kind of just a few of my comments, and I'll leave it to kind of also situate Somalia in a broader context of what we know about oil governance. Obviously, it's a big, widely documented discourse, and the point was just to highlight a few kind of the issues I see going forward that Joachim has addressed, and also the issue of how we understand transparency and corruption and how it's understood in kind of global standards is still there's a lot of further work that needs to be done, and that's my main point.
Okay, thanks very much, Claire. Okay, so we have some questions and I want to get onto them as quick as possible, but it's only fair to give Joachim a chance to reply if you would like to if you want to say anything in reply to any of the panelists' points, then please.
Yes. Thank you, Claire, Mohammed, and Abdisalam for your interesting comments. I think they're very good comments because they kind of triggers some thoughts also in terms of clarification. I think Claire pushes the button when it comes to by mentioning corruption and transparency as being some of the key issues here. And one can say that the legislative process and the notion of institutionalization in Somalia in regards to the oil sector has had a very long history. It's actually began in 2008, and you know it has taken this long until now, until you know some of the institutions and some of the legislative frameworks are starting to come into place. And what's been happening in that history and the reasons for the delays is where some of the illumination of the problems actually lies. But first, I want to say that some of your comments also reflects a little bit of the illusion around petroleum in Somalia, which also have been driving a lot of blind support forward, which is this is going to generate employment, education, healthcare sector, investments, etc. And I would be so cheeky to say, no, it's not until 20 years from now. Okay, so there's not going to be any immediate effects out of this, not at all. Okay, that doesn't mean that Somalia shouldn't have its own revenue sources and become less dependent on the external. By all means, yes, that's what we want. But it's very important for that to happen that the institutional process is being done thoroughly, that it has full transparency, and that there is full backing to it. And this is where I want to contend the comment. And yes, the law was passed, but not in full agreement. Puntland didn't take part in it. They stepped out and actually walked out of the session. So Puntland actually declares that they are not in this petroleum law right now. Okay. So what is the status of a law if there's a federal member state that's not in it? The whole issue about Somaliland is outstanding. It's not in there. Then how are you going to solve that issue, right? The recent story that I focused on from my blog and until now on the Somalia Petroleum Authority is very important. And many people kind of dismisses it as not being very important, but this is actually extremely important. First of all, yes, it had to be established within 6 months after the law was signed. The law having controversies in itself. There's a general agreement about the Baidoa agreement, but there's also concerns. Nevertheless, the Somalia Petroleum Authority is going to have a very independent role in terms of negotiating the production sharing agreements in the future. And the members is actually going to have a high level of permanence. So whoever sits in this board and control this board is clearly very, very important. Yeah. And who they have connections with and what is the access is going to be very important. So it's not a casual matter, right? So rushing that through, and hence the title of this presentation, what's the rush? What's the oil rush? Yeah, why rush it? You know, so you are in the process, but it's not complete. Why rush to doing the oil licensing while it is not completely ready yet? Yeah, and as mentioned, I mean, there's outstanding legislative issues. First of all, the model production sharing agreement needs to be aligned with the Procurement Act. The extractive industries income tax bill has not been passed yet. There cannot be done oil licenses until that law has been passed. Yeah. Other elements are, as you mentioned, the accountability institutions. Yes, they're in the process of being implemented, but they're not ready yet. Yeah. So, you know, whatever that's going to happen in terms of disputes, if the justice sector is not being more reliable and considered less corrupt than is the case right now, there's going to be a problem, for instance. Yeah. The parliamentary committees, there's a lack of a constitutional court, but the parliamentary committees, they need to have capabilities. And this is one of the things that the international partners have been neglecting very much. As much as they put resources into the central bank and the Ministry of Finance to set up financial management information systems, they have not put equal resources into the oversight institutions' capabilities of doing independent investigations into the issues under their resort. National Resource Council or Commission, or whatever it's going to be called, which was part of the Baidoa Agreement, has to be set up. Somaliland is an entire different issue, but Somaliland is in the process of issuing its own petroleum law and production sharing agreements with General Energy and RAK Gas. Yeah. The actual status of the agreements with TGS and Somalia, which is now called Coastal Explorations, are examples of the lack of transparency. Yeah. And the best thing the Ministry of Petroleum and the government could do is to put all the documents on the table, put all the agreements out there, and have them reassessed, and have the parliamentary committees do this, right? We need that to be done to get the shadow to go away. Otherwise, it's going to stay there. Hence, the issue of the oil blocks that are for sale, the 7 oil blocks, avoiding the maritime zone, yes. The issue, and I've not been talking about the maritime issue with Kenya and the disputed area, but the 7 blocks avoided all the 12 blocks that Somar Oil wanted. Yeah, and that raises the question, why? All right, so that's something that needs to be clarified. Yeah, for establishing trust in the sector. You know, it's not only whether, you know, okay, maybe you are doing things right, but nobody believes you and there's no trust, then you have political instability, yeah, and misperceptions, right? And that's not healthy. And finally, the Somalia has not signed up for the International Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which is, you know, a Norwegian-based initiative setting the global standards for good governance of oil and mineral resources. I think it's very important that they show that they want to do that and they want to implement these things. Hence, benefits are not going to be happening 10 years from now, yeah? So why not get everything right before you start pushing it? Yeah, and why does this sudden push happen? All of a sudden, you know, procrastination from 2016, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, and then 20, legislation getting rushed. Why? Election time, right? I'll leave it there.
Okay, thanks very much. I feel like the panelists might want to reply, but perhaps we can go on to the Q&A and in the course of them. Okay, Mohammed, if you want to very briefly get back on that point.
Thank you so much. I find this debate and the presentation of Joachim very interesting, actually. But there are two issues. Number one is, do you think we should have been any institutions if we would have waited building a proper state in Somalia? How the entire state building started, Joachim knows very well, and I hope other panelists knows very well. You know, it started with holding conference for the warlords, and then creating some transitional government, reforming the transitional government, and making second transitional government, and then permanent government, and then another government, federal government taking over, and in between establishing federal member states. So if you look this process, you know, it tells you two things. One is you will never find in the nature of this life, everything perfect and in place. No, everything will always be incomplete. Even the most advanced institutions in the West, always they are reformers. You have to devise new regulations. You have to adapt, the framework of the institution. And that's the perspective I'm coming from. Meaning that, I'm saying we can improve things along the way because there has been improvements. If you see from where it started, the whole process of state building, and I believe personally, this oil thing could improve, the state institutions, could establish, in a way, mechanisms for transparency, could help in good governance, and could help in defeating Al-Shabaab, because of largely the problem of Al-Shabaab exists due to unemployment of the Somali youngsters. And also it could affect the issue of migration. We Somalis, we have so many youngsters, dying in along the sea or along the desert, smuggling from Somalia all the way to Sudan and the desert between Sudan and Libya, and then taking the risk of traveling to Europe through boat.
Sorry, Mohammed, I don't want to cut you off, but I do want to make sure that we have time for some of the questions. I realize that that also Abdus Salam has a reply, but would we be able to go to the questions and perhaps we can return to this point? Okay, so we have a number of questions and they are not addressed to anyone in particular, so I think they're open to all of the panelists to reply to. The first one is from Abdullahi Hagi, and it is Somalia isn't ready for oil exploration because we don't have the laws in place to protect the environment. The fishery industry is more important than the oil and gas industry, and we expect that renewable energy is the future and fossil energy is the past. So the question is, what is the oil rush that you're talking about with this climate where ROI is not good and supply of energy is way more than demand? And a second question I'll put to you all is from Patrick Mollier. All those discussions, I think this is in reference to Joachim's initial presentation, avoid the main issue. How could an unknown and unexperienced new company get blocks, the best as per the Spectrum seismic results? How come the oil minister asked Spectrum to give all Spectrum data on a free of charge basis to Somalia coastline exploration under their new name? So if any of you would like to address those points, then I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, I would like to address Abdullahi Haji's question of where he stated that the marine resources are more important than oil. I believe, Somali marine resources have a huge potential for development and to generate a lot of wealth. And I believe, environmental mitigation strategies and proper mechanisms to protect the environment could be put in place, But that does not mean, not exploring or extracting oil and gas. Somalia can diversify its different resources, develop its different resources, and along the way, establish whatever mechanisms and institutions that's needed. And if you look, one of the things that when you look deeply about Somalia and how things progressed for the last 10 years is, institutions are fast learning. Society is, capable and very resilient. I don't think, Somalia could ever be a dictatorship. And just to cut a short example of this is the initial tendency of the federal government under the leadership of President Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo was just to do away federalism. And they used it for the last 3 years to do away all regional states, but they never succeeded. And the reason is we have social structure and there are mechanisms embedded in in that social structure. And we are very autonomous as a society. Somali individuals are very autonomous. And, you know, politicians or whatever elites, they have to pay at some point, you know, the price of whatever, trying to manipulate the system and authority. And in that sense, that's why I am more optimistic about things, possibility of improving things and making things function. I mean, whether it is oil extraction, or whether it is marine resource development, or whether it is, you know, building up infrastructure.
Thanks. Yeah, Joachim. And also, if anyone would like to address the other question from Patrick about the unknown company, yeah, Joachim.
Just briefly to Mohammed as well on the first question. I need to emphasize that the employment benefits and the financial revenue benefits to Somalia are not going to materialize substantially, not even within the first 10 years. Okay, I think you need to take a deep breath and accept that fact. And also the kind of investments that we are talking about. Yeah, I mean, an oil rig costs in the neighborhood of $150 million. Yeah, so the only ones who really can do that responsibly for you would be the oil majors, who can raise this kind of capital, right? And the oil majors, they need to know that some of the basic structures are substantially well enough in place for them to trust the investments, right? Companies like Somalia and Coastal Exploration, which now plays a little bit into Patrick Mollier's question, is that these companies are not going to raise this kind of capital for you, right? And this kind of companies is the kind of companies you need to avoid, yeah? So the problem is that if you're rushing the oil licensing round through now, and you're selling out now for some very fast benefits, it's going to be like peeing in your pants in winter time in Norway to keep warm. You know how fast you're going to get even more cold afterwards. Yeah, because these oil licenses will most likely go to the intermediate types of companies, yeah, who don't have the capital, who are just waiting and going to keep the licenses to flipping them on later on, right? Right, and there will be enough resources in that for whoever actors will be able to capitalize on those funds. Okay. So to Patrick's question about Spectrum Oil and Summer Oil, yes, I did hear the rumor that apparently the government had asked Spectrum Oil to give away their survey data for free to Summer Oil. Well, I mean, we don't know, but this is exactly the kind of things that you don't want to happen. Yeah, because if the oil licenses go to this kind of companies, even in 10 years time, you won't start having any benefit. That's why, even though it's taking a long time, yes, there has been progress. I do not disagree with that. It's just not finished yet.
Thanks very much. Would either Abdusalam or Claire like to add to that before I continue with the questions? Okay, so we have a third question from, sorry, we have a lot of questions, I'm just looking through them. A question from Dr. Ahmed Herzi from the Institute for Peace, Security and Development, who says, oil and gas exploration started in Somalia in the 1950s and 60s with a total of 70 wells drilled, 80% of which were onshore. Many major companies, including ExxonMobil, BP, Texaco and Shell, were active in the region at the time. In the 60s, before civil unrest stifled the sector, 5 discoveries were made, but all were considered sub-commercial. What is your perspective on that? And then they have a cheeky second question. It's only supposed to be one question, but Somali oil and gas potential faces institutional gaps. How do you read that? And third, do you think that Western oil exploration in Somalia may spark conflict?
What's the last question? You can repeat it.
Do you think that Western oil exploration in Somalia may spark conflict? And again, I think that's open to all of you. Mohammed, please.
Thank you so much. I would like to focus on the last question of the issue of oil exploration being able to cause potentially could cause conflict. I believe that would not be the case because of, Somalia now has, this is my view, has done with the conflict. All the conflict you have that's left in Somalia is the issue of Al-Shabaab. But then whatever conflicts that are there are just the political conflicts, and there is no active confrontation in militarized whatever battlefield is in Somalia left. This being said, I do think, there could be some political conflicts, but that will not end as an active confrontation. I mean, military or whatever confrontation between different parts. And there are two reasons for this. One is the Somali population is tired of a conflict. 30 years of chaos and conflict is more than enough. Now, what you have is just the political issues and political contestation rather than active conflict. This is beyond Al-Shabaab. Al-Shabaab is there, and they have a, they are active in waging terror attacks. And the other reason is, IACOM has published extensively on this. We have, in Somali society, we have institutions, traditional institutions, and those are very good in accessing different political elites, putting pressure on them, sorting out potential conflicts, and we did, and they are still very effective. So those, for those two reasons, I don't think this could lead confrontational conflict, if I could say that. But there could be tensions from time to time until you have some sort of political settlement and those things.
Thanks. Joachim. You're on mute. Sorry.
Yep. I was muted. In terms of the last question, following up on Mohammed, guys, I don't think it would immediately spark any open conflict in that sense. But I mean, there's definitely political conflict as yet. And well, it remains to see how the situation and the issue with Puntland is going to be sorted out, of course. Yeah. And in that, such as the sorting out of the Galmudug administration and Southwest states, where what appears is that unwritten and unpublished games about promises in which, for instance, the construction of Hobyo Port played a major role in solving the Southwest states, and how money flew around and for what purpose, and what was clear was that half was not very happy, in terms of the oil legislative process that was ongoing. And Hobyo Port is an old dream. I've been spoken with a number of Somali actors, back in 2010-11 in the Westgate, where a lot of them like to, before it was attacked, there would be people asking me, what do you think about Hobyo and the Hobyo Port? And I asked, so what about Hobyo Port? And they would say, well, it's of major financial importance for what? An oil pipeline. An oil pipeline for what? linking to Ethiopia, right? So there's onshore oil, most likely in Galmudug. There's the offshore oil. There's the oil fields in the Somalia region, where Hobyo would be the closest place to bring an oil pipeline for export, obviously. Now, I would be extremely surprised if that did not play a role in the brokering games. Now, the issue is in terms of major benefits. I don't think the institutional gaps are there. I mentioned them to the second question. In terms of the perspectives of the where the oil fields may be, and in the past it was 80%. I mean, the focus has gone on the offshore oil for two reasons. Largely because that's where the Somoil and Spectrum carried out their survey. So that's where we have the most recent data. And there are rumors of covert data, which can't be confirmed, but I have seen some of the notes which comes from intelligence sources and which are so detailed that they can't be completely random. But there has been, according to these notes, I can't confirm it, that there is petroleum in Lower Shabelle, in the Shabelle Basin, and then also onshore in Galmudug. The past surveys showed that there was major gas potentials on the Coriole and the bases around these places, and this is the areas in which there's major attention of the conflict with Al-Shabaab is particularly there. It's an area where there's increasingly attention of development aid from both UK and US side. There's a large concentration of aid. I know it's going to be justified by this is also where you will have the greatest humanitarian risks. The Americans, they want military bases. They have Baladogle, they want to set up in kilometer 50. There has recently been constructed an airstrip in Barawa. Very fine. I think it's an open question, and also it's a question of how the process is being managed. Yeah, I would be very cautious to reduce the issues of conflict in Somalia to only a question of war with Al-Shabaab, because as being involved in Somalia over the past 20 years and being there on the ground when Al-Shabaab arose, I never saw Al-Shabaab as a completely foreign entity that has completely nothing to do and is not playing into the conflicts between the Somali clans. So there's a whole spectrum there. It's a little bit more complex than that, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you. We're just past 4:20. We have permission from comms to run a bit late, so we can go for an extra 15 minutes. But if you could try and keep your answers and any further questions as brief as possible, that would be great, so we can get through some more. So the next question is from Hassan Mudain. Given that Puntland has declared itself outside the petroleum law, that Somaliland remains a separate entity, and election processes and outcomes in other member states have been extremely controversial, it's not clear what the status of the law in fact is, nor whether it's possible to complete the SPA in time. For instance, an obvious question is, what would the status of the SPA be if several FMS are not present in its board in accordance with the law? And what is the procedure for nominating the board members? And then I'm going to add another question from Abdel Nasser Mohammed, which is, the governance of Somalia is very poor, and the politicians don't have the capacity and understanding to handle matters that are important for the Somali people. A good example is vote selling and buying in election times, as Mr. Gundel confirms as well. Also, the government doesn't control the whole country. don't you think it's absurd to talk about Somali petroleum and it's only the greed of the international countries and companies pushing it? So I'll open that up to Abdussalam, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I will try to answer the question from Hassan Mudane. And actually, as Joachim also mentioned, we have to remember that the process of petroleum law started in 2008, and both the federal government of Somalia and the international community has really invested on this finalization of this petroleum law, actually. And also, we have to mention that the federal member states, including Puntland, have signed the Baidaba agreement, actually, which is now being considered as part of the constitution. Coming to the SPA, as far as we know, the federal government of Somalia will nominate 2 representatives, and each member state will nominate 1 representative. That means Puntland can have its share and can nominate 1 person. It's according up to them, and it's that there are certain professional qualifications or criteria that's required each member to fulfill. So what I believe is that since the international community has heavily invested on finalization of petroleum law, there has been resource sharing agreement, production sharing agreement. The federal member states came together in 2018, including Puntland, have signed the petroleum, the resource sharing agreement, which really specifies, or which is really perceived as the document, a preliminary reference for national resource sharing. So I believe that when it's all these kind of regulatory framework is in place, the federal government of Somalia is also ready to open dialogue and talks with the member states. So we should not be saying that, okay, Puntland is not part of the licensing process. Somaliland declared its independence many years ago. So we should not say that we should wait them. Actually, we should wait Puntland and Somaliland. My viewpoint is that it is the government of Somalia, the federal government of Somalia, which has the mandate of the Somali people. It has the right to continue this licensing process. My recommendation would be that the federal government of Somalia should try to satisfy, should negotiate, should open a dialogue with Puntland and maybe Somaliland, and should also persuade them that this is for the Somali people, we're gonna benefit it. We should have to start the licensing process as early as possible. And everybody knows that the licensing process of Somalia has started, in 1960s and early 1970s. So how long we may wait until we exploit our natural resources? So the process should start. We should test the different blocks that are currently being auctioned, and a lot of oil exploration companies have shown an interest to go into contract. The international community is helping Somalia also to best use their vast, enormous natural resources. So I believe that we should not say that SPA we can say that SPA there is controversy actually, but that can also be solved easily. It's all about dialogue. If Puntland and federal member states and the government of Somalia sit together, they can agree on the formulas of revenue sharing, on who will represent from member states, and so on. That's my contribution to the question from Hassan.
Yes, you can.
Actually, very brief. It's a high-stake political power game. Actually, with Puntland and Somaliland, because with a very high risk. Yeah, because if you push forward and playing the power game on them, saying, okay, now we're just going ahead without you, and then you can come along, and then they will lose influence if they don't come along, right? The high risk is that you are pushing to the fragmentation, right? And then you are playing a high game, that, okay, ultimately, they will have to creep in because we have the power. And to play this game is in line with, I think you mentioned yourself, of how the Farmajo regime has playing the centralization cards and actually does not want the federal member states at the end of the day. right? And for this reason, also have been playing some controversial games of getting what one could say is proxy governments in place in Galmudug and Southwest States, etc., and Hirshabelle, no? So the SPA, it was mentioned, it was asked, what's the procedure for appointing the members? And briefly, I don't see, other than stating that there should be 2 members from the federal member states, doesn't actually say anything about the procedure of how these are being appointed, right? So if we take it from the point of view of personalized politics, then what we see is that it's the presidents in the different states that are appointing this. They have to be appointed according to qualifications, yeah? But there has not been a procedure, a vetting procedure or anything like that, or a commission. It just happened. And when it just happened, it happened in the context of a cabinet vacuum, which basically, according to which is unconstitutional. So if you have to get that right, now that there is a prime minister, and as soon as he has appointed a new cabinet, if you want to rectify this, they have to reappoint a cabinet, a Somali Petroleum Authority, all over again.
Thanks. Okay, I think we will ask this perhaps as a final question from O. Yusuf. So to you, Kim, you mentioned Gulf countries and the UK. What's Norway's role? Spectrum in TGS or Norwegian? And actually, I'm sure the other panelists might like to comment on that as well.
Okay. Do you want Abdi Salam or I go on now?
Whoever would like to reply.
Okay. Well, I mean, Norway's role is different than the UK and the US in the sense that they do not have oil companies with old legacy concessions that they want to defend or anything like that. But they engaged in terms of the EEC zone early on, already in 2007, 8, 9. And we're pushing for this economic zone. But at that time, out of an interest coming from the disputed maritime zone with Kenya, because Statoil, the Norwegian oil company, had interest in the disputed zone at that time. Eventually, they fell out with the Kenyans, and the interest then changed increasingly towards Somalia. Norway has also been playing a role, which, I mean, formally speaking, was also interesting in terms of helping institution building, helping governance, and wanting to push forward for oil interests as well in what Mohammed and Abdi Salam are also mentioning, in terms of generating income and revenue in Somalia. But I mean, there's also the commercial interest. Spectrum, which is now owned by TGS or merged with TGS, which is a part Norwegian and American company. I mean, their interest right now is to get the oil licensing going. Why? Because their business model is to sell the survey data. Yeah. So the sooner the oil licensing can go on, they can get their investment for their surveys coming back in. Then there's a question of to what extent Norway has been helping Somalia to build an oil trust fund. But I contacted NORAD and they said, well, not really. We don't have done that, but we have probably had it as part of some of our training programs to the Ministry of Finance. That's all I can say at this point.
Thank you so much. Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up in a minute or two, but I'd like to invite the panelists if you have any final comments. And Mohammed, I think you would like to add something.
Yeah, thank you so much. As far as I am aware about Norway and its involvement in Somalia is, I think Norway has been doing a lot of good job in terms of, as Jakob said, institutional building, capacity building, establishing financial systems in Somalia. And those are the things that actually will matter or matter for Somalis and for the country's stability and progress. On the top of this, I have been in Somalia last year, and I have traveled far and wide across Somalia. And wherever I go, actually, I could see, you know, some schools or hospitals or other projects funded by Norway. That is to the credit of Norway. But then whatever a prime minister or former speaker of the parliament he does, you know, I don't think it reflects about Norway. So I think Somalis are very grateful to Norway and other international donors that has been, you know, helping and providing different sources of relief and humanitarian aid, but as also on development and capacity building and institutional building. But then whatever is there, whatever questions that are there, I'm sure it could be sorted out actually. And one of the very good thing about Norway is they have a very good experience in terms of transparency when it comes to oil and establishing oil funds and managing oil resources, you know, and revenues. And I think those are the kind of experience Somalia needs. And that's very welcome.
Thanks, Mohammed. Claire and Abdussalam, would you like to make a final?
Just a brief comment. I think it also kind of supports the point I was trying to make also about transparency in networks. You know, it's a very minor point, but again, it's this association between the speaker, former Speaker of Parliament, and now former Prime Minister, and Norway, and the extent to which, as Norwegian diaspora, that they're pushing, that they're being used to kind of push through certain agendas. And the fact that that's probably, as we know, not the case, or in certain ways not the case, but that kind of relation, that understanding and the perception, and the fact that probably we don't discuss enough about what Norway is doing that's good. And there's a whole, it's been looked at quite a lot, the issues that Norway has in terms of transparency and development and foreign policy agendas more generally, and in Somalia, but also elsewhere. So they do have issues in combating these allegations as well, but we could probably do more in Somalia to also to clarify that there is good. They are training, you know, they're training within the Ministry of Petroleum, and they are allowing Somalia through the North Fund to apply and to qualify for debt relief. You know, there's a whole nother relationship now between Norway's involvement in pushing Somalia to qualify for debt relief. And I don't know if we've talked about the relationship between oil and debt relief, but I know Joachim touches on it in his paper. So I think again, it's you know, the extent to which Kaira's relationship with Norway also ultimately led to his dismissal. I mean, that's the big factor, the perception that he was pushing through his self-interest. So again, perceptions, transparency, as it relates not only to funds and to documents, but also to people and to perceptions of what interests are being served by whom, is a big factor in Somalia. And for any future oil interests will be, there needs to be, you know, clarity on those factors too.
Thanks, Claire. Okay, it looks like the final word goes to you, Abdussalam.
Yes, actually, as far as I guess, Spectrum and TGS are trying to sell their data to potential oil companies who are planning to do exploration in Somalia. And as far as the government of Norway is concerned, actually, there are close to 45 or 42,000 Somalis living in Norway. And the Norwegian government has been really helping Somalia in terms of it is, you know, that it helps through its international agencies like the Norwegian Refugee Council, Norwegian Church Aid, and the government of Norway has been supporting the Somali government actually in different ways. And their office in Nairobi, the Kenyan, the Somali office, the East Africa office in Kenya, is also investing or supporting many projects that are currently being run in Somalia. So the issue of Norway, there could be some interest companies that have some commercial interest to sell either their data to be part of the exploration process. But again, also Norway has a good experience. It's one of the oil producing countries, and it could be that the Norwegian government is going to support the Somali government in terms of institutional capacity building, in terms of training them what's good when it comes to petroleum law, when it comes to how resources can be shared, because it has a good model. The Norwegians have been leading their revenues for the sake of for their future generations. So I think there is a lot of benefit from Norway, both in terms of these consultants companies that are selling their data to potential oil exploration companies, and also the state of Norway that's also helping the government of Somalia. It could be also relating to humanitarian assistance and development assistance funding that's also coming from Norway. So I'm really optimistic that the Norwegian government is providing a good support to Somalia, and it's something that's commendable actually.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. I think we're going to have to draw to a close, but I want to thank you all again for your expertise and sharing them this afternoon. So this would be when we would have a round of applause, but Joachim, Mohammed, Abdul Salam, Claire, thank you so much for joining us, and for everybody who's tuned in today. Just to add that we have another Somalia event on the 10th of November on the Galkayo Peace Agreement, and please do join us for that if you're free. And a very good evening, afternoon to everyone. Thank you.